This is our world. At almost 25,000 miles wide, it's a very big place, but it's starting to get smaller. You see, here's a map showing internet connections around the world. We're starting to light up like a Christmas tree. And it gets more interesting when you start looking at internet traffic. It truly is a world wide web. I mean, heck, it even looks like a web. There's a ton of communication going on, but how are people communicating? They're communicating online, on sites with forms and inputs similar to this. This is my new global business idea, MakeItRain.pizza. You choose when and where you want it to rain beautiful, cheese-dripping goodness from the heavens, what your budget is, and a contact number for us to confirm everything with you, and we'll take care of the rest. I know it's going to be the next big thing, so I'm being sure to design it to scale globally, because I know this thing is going to explode. This website is a great example of gathering data through form inputs because, like many others, there are a variety of inputs we have to consume and somehow output those in a way that is understandable to as wide of an audience as possible. It's like putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, trying to take all the different and sometimes broken data and clean it up to a state that's usable and actionable. How do we make sense of such a mess? Let's go through and dissect this pretty simple and straightforward page. We'll start with the date field. And just to keep the children's story motif going, let's see how deep this rabbit hole goes. Let's start with this formatting first. What day is this? Whatever you thought it was, I'm going to say that you're wrong because this is really open to interpretation. You see, we're used to seeing our dates formatted this way, month, then day, then year. So we'd know that 10/31/2015 is actually October 31st of the year 2015, and it'd be time for trick-or-treating. We'd also know that this is December 12th, and it works great for us on this side of the pond. We start to run into issues, though, when we look at our friends over on the other side of the pond. Here's the same date, but in places like England, they read the date, day, month, year. So this reads it's the 12th of December, 2012. That's okay until we hit something like this, 7/4/2015. So while the Brits are celebrating World Health Day on the 7th of April and probably eating apples and jogging, we read it as July 4th, and we know that it's time to party, barbecue, and blow things up. So how do we not confuse this very different data, even though it looks identical? Some people are trying to create global standards. The International Organization for Standardization, ISO, not iOS as it should be, but you'll notice strange acronyms as we go. I blame the French. Has a recommendation for how all dates should be formatted. Here's what they propose as a global ISO standard. And you know what? I agree with them. By formatting the day in year, month, day order, we avoid showing cultural bias, and it flows in a natural order, moving from least to most granular. What this means is that files sorted by this method will order themselves automatically with no extra effort or folder systems. And any way you look at it, it just makes sense. They've even standardized the dividers for us too. I'm sure you've all seen slashes or dots or dashes to separate date fields. With this standardized system, there's no need to worry about what format different cultures or regions use. So here's my recommendation for the date input field. We logically break the input into the basic elements, but we should allow the user to continuously type in their entry. This allows for blazingly fast inputs, which is very helpful seeing as this input type is a favorite upon longer forms and very technical forms. Here's the date all filled out. Also notice there's a calendar icon on the right of the input. This activates a GUI calendar that allows the user to visually select the appropriate date. Even if they're unfamiliar with the formatting, the GUI solution allows them to confidently select the right date in a format that's intimately familiar with them. The system is fast for power users, but approachable enough for even the most computer illiterate users. If you really want to avoid any possible confusion with the date, you can change the month portion to be an abbreviation in a drop-down. There are some tricks to allow power users to still quickly type through all the fields, but most users will remove their hands from their keyboards to select this item. It also introduces a little wrinkle with translations and localization, but again, with the improvement on clarity. In this format, there's never confusion over what each field is capturing. Okay, so dates are solved in my unbiased and all-knowing opinion. A job well done. Now let's move on to the next element of scheduling, which is time. So we've covered now that everyone has an opinion on date formatting. Okay, surely this time thing is going to be more straightforward, right? I mean, there are only 24 hours in a day, and clocks all look the same. Here are the different time zones in the world. How many are there? Well, 24 technically. Perfect. 24 time zones, 24 hours in a day. This is all shaping up really well. Unfortunately, it's not all that black and white. You see, not every time zone is 1 hour. Some are 30 or 45 minutes off the hour. Okay, but they're evenly spaced about every 15 degrees, right? Here's a close-up of some of the islands in the Pacific at the international dateline. We can see that the time zones are not even or uniform. Plus, there's that funny little international dateline that we have to deal with. So, as an example, if you were in the French Polynesia and needed some sugar for your cereal in the morning, say you're waking up around 8 or so, you could hop over to your neighbors in the Cook Islands who are also waking up at around the same time. Or maybe you're closer to the Line Islands there. If you hurry, you might be able to catch them before they go to bed at 8 p.m. tomorrow. Yeah. Now, things get even crazier when you start to factor in daylight saving time. Here's a map of countries, or at least the parts of them, that follow DST. As you can see, a good portion of the world, especially the southern hemisphere, doesn't arbitrarily change their clocks an hour. Once you factor in DST into the time zones, there are currently about 60 variations of time zones. But we're America, and at least we know what's best. We have our stuff figured out, right? Here are our time zones. They seem to randomly weave themselves through most states, like that little portion of Kansas we got here, and, overall they're not too bad, but whoa, what's Arizona doing down there? All right, well, you see, Arizona doesn't feel that they need to, quote, maximize their sunlight with DST, so they said forget about it, and they don't change their clocks. But you'll notice that it's not all solid. Here are the Navajo and Hopi reservations in the northeastern part of Arizona and their surrounding states. You see, the Navajo, they observe DST, unlike Arizona and the Hopi Nation. That means if you drove this 100-mile stretch, you'd have to change your watch 7 times. What's the takeaway here? Well, we can't trust our data is going to be straightforward, even down to individual territory levels, let alone states, countries, or the world. Well, at least ISO will save us like they did last time. There's good news and there's bad news. The good news is there is a standard. The bad news? This is the ISO format. You got T for time, then there's 19 hours, 24 minutes, and 53 seconds. And finally, it's minus 8 hours from UTC, or Coordinated Universal Time. Again, acronym doesn't line up. Sometimes this UTC has been referred to as Zulu time or Greenwich Mean Time, but UTC is really where you want to go now. So where do we start? First, let's change the UTC to a time zone for users. UTC is better, and it's going to be how you're going to be storing all this information in your database, but to general users, most of them actually have no idea what their UTC offset is. So we'll change this to an identifiable time zone, and in this case, it'll be PST. Next, we'll drop the T because it's stupid and distracting, and we'll give ourselves some space between time and time zone for readability. Let's remove the seconds for simplicity. If you're working in the scientific area or somewhere very technical, then you might need seconds or even potentially something a lot more granular than that. But for most general purpose websites, minutes are by far as granular as you need to get with users. In the US, we use a 12-hour clock, so we'll change that 19 to a 07. And that also means we need to add the PM to the time. I don't necessarily think that 12-hour formatting is better than 24-hour, but scheduling is already so difficult without asking users to have to calculate the proper time in their head, so we'll stick with it for now. So that PM is getting a little confusing with the time zone over there, so let's change it to this style, but now that feels a little bit detached and hard to read. So we'll pull it in and we'll remove the dots, and this helps to associate it with the time and also differentiates it from the time zone. Perfect, that's starting to look pretty good. So here's a look at what the input should look like. Users can enter their hours and minutes, and we separate the fields with a colon to help with identification and visual processing. And finally, we default to the user's time zone. We can either try to intelligently do this, but there are a lot of issues with this, as we saw earlier, so usually we want to let them set it in their preferences. This could become another field if you'd like to let a user select it, but we'll get to that in a minute. So this is all good, but what about the 12-hour clock observers? The teal countries here observe the 12-hour system like we do here in the US with an AM and a PM of some sort. The yellow countries go straight 24 hours. The magenta ones, well, they haven't really figured out what they want, so they go either way. Regardless, here's what the input looks like if the user has set their preference to a 12-hour display. Again, you can try to guess this based on where they are, but it's recommended that you let the user decide what they're most comfortable with. Here's what the input looks like filled out, and here's how we display that data. You can see that we clean and format it differently than the way we accept the input. This is the Humpty Dumpty stuff we talked about earlier, cleaning and processing the data we receive and putting it all back together again. This input also works for Chinese times. They use a 12-hour clock like we do, but as you can tell, their AM/PM format is a little different than ours. That symbol, the Zha Wu, or in the afternoon, I know I killed that, please, no comments. We can accept it in the same location if we'd like, but we can represent it in front when we go to display it. Here's a time zone selector that I use and have had a ton of success with. Users love this thing. We see the time zone up top with the UTC below, as well as a further identifier for the zone. This identifier is important because of the DST mess that we went over. There can be same or similar time zones that, in specific locations, have slightly different rules for their time adjustments. The key thing in this example is at 9:24 a.m. over on the side. You should display your time zones if the users want to just browse through them in order of what their actual time is currently. So that way the user usually knows, okay, it's about 9:24 in the morning. Let me scroll to that time, and by displaying it over here, you really help them to narrow down exactly what they're trying to pick. From there, it's an easy choice for the user. We also need to allow users to search for their time zone, and they should be able to search on anything. Here we can see searching for Asia brings up all the results with Asia in it. But remember, we need to allow them to search on anything. Here we can see searching for 7 brings up local times as well as the UTC times. Searching for time zones can be very strange and confusing. Anything that we can help to make that decision more clear, the better. Look really quick before we move on at Mountain Standard Time. You can see here there's one time zone, but 3 different variations on it. All right, dates, solved. Time, solved. Next. Well, we all know that time is money, so let's tackle that one next. How much is this? Spoiler alert, it's always going to be a trick question. The correct answer is actually somewhere around $76. I'm not lying to you, and I'm not trying to trick you necessarily. You're just confused, and for good reason. You see, 100 Canadian dollars is not equal to 100 US dollars. In fact, given the current conversion rates, it's approximately $76.51. Currency symbols like these are used for marketing and shorthand purposes. They're only good if there's no confusion regarding cross-pollination. They're great for localized communications like supermarket ads that don't have to necessarily worry about international audiences. Here, the familiarity allows for the shorthand. We don't have to worry about currency confusion at a grocery store in the middle of Kansas. Odds are it's going to be US dollars. Here's the format I recommend for currency. Allow users to enter their amounts, and for international websites, dictate the currency type. It's always best to avoid all confusion when you're dealing with money. You know, it's kind of funny, but people actually get really mad when you screw up stuff with their money. This approach makes sure there's no assumptions or confusion. Pro tip for all your fields, be sure to lock down your field and data types. So when you try to run a report, answers like this, or this make it really not fun. Save yourself and your users the frustration. You may think it's funny, but I've seen this kind of garbage and worse. Good news is, when someone asks you to run a chart with this kind of bad data, you can just shrug back at them. So now that you're a pro with currency, let's discuss something that makes sense. Ah yes, puns, the highest and most noble form of comedy. Here's an amount. Everything looks kosher, right? Whoa. What the heck's going on here? This is insane, right? Well, you see, the areas in blue represent the decimal with a point, like we do. The areas in green use a comma instead to represent the decimal. ISO will bring reason to this mess, right? Obviously, they're going to side with us because we all know it's a decimal point, not those crazy foreigners, right? Uh-oh. Bad news. The comma, technically, is the international standard for decimals and blueprints, says the ISO. Wait a minute. Let's be reasonable here. Again, that's just stupid. Everyone knows that it's called a decimal point. You see, this is one of those very disorienting items. People in different regions have been raised with their native standard, and most have no idea that there's any other method besides their own. So it's best to create a system that can dynamically display the, quote, proper display of the decimal based on a user's region. In fact, if your application is fairly technical, this will likely manifest in quite a few places, so I'd strongly recommend allowing users to manually set their preferences in their settings. Okay, currency is in the bag, and I think after all that name calling, it's probably best that we call and apologize to our foreign friends. Oh wait, those guys are also the ones with those crazy number formatting, right? Phone numbers that look like this gibberish. Well, I got a solution for that. Here's how I recommend combating against those madmen. The trick is, there's one key item in a phone number that we can exploit and use to our advantage. It's the country code. This one field will inform us with all the information we need to make the right decisions on how we format phone numbers. Here's what a phone number looks like in the fields. As you can see, we don't allow anything but numbers into the field. No letters or symbols or dashes or parentheses, nothing. You can allow for a wider range of entries in the extension field if you'd like, but you can see here that the output is perfectly clean and appropriately formatted because we know that country code, and therefore we know the proper way to format phone numbers for this area. So US number with a country code of 1, we know it's going to be the area code, which is the first 3 digits, and we're going to put those in parentheses, then a space, then 3 more digits, a dash, and the last 4 digits. Here's a UK phone number. Again, everything is perfectly displayed, including the added extension. We can do the heavy lifting for users so they don't have to worry about formatting rules or anything that may potentially change on them. We can update our libraries, and it's totally seamless to our end user. Well, that went surprisingly smoothly. Thanks, country code. Now all our phone numbers work. Before we go any further, there's one other thing that's been bothering me about this site. So we have our beautiful forms and our beautiful labels over to the left. It's one line, really easy to read. Your eye just glides across it. Perfect. Well, let's look at what happens when we expand MakeItRain.pizza into Germany, which I'm assuming will be soon because, again, this thing is just going to blow up. Oh dear. This is one of the things we really have to watch for as we move into other languages. I mean, German is the poster child for this anomaly because the average German word is about 40% longer than its English equivalent. A great way to combat against this is to move our labels to the top of the input. What we sacrifice in vertical space, we gain in flexibility. And besides, mobile devices have already trained users to scroll, so that vertical space that we're sacrificing isn't as big a loss as it once may have been. A lot of responsive frameworks like Bootstrap will handle this for you as your screen constricts. That being said, more and more it's the norm just to see the labels always over the top of fields, because it's easier to make other visual adjustments, like right-to-left formatting. This is actually a lot easier to implement than you may think if your site conforms to web design standards. So why are mobile and localization so important? Well, let's take a look at the last roughly 20 years. This is the global internet penetration rate. Adoption has been staggering, with almost 2 in 5 people now having access to the internet. Asia alone is over half of internet users today. But you know what's really striking? Let's look at this same thing from a mobile phone perspective. 20 years ago, it was only 1% of the world's population had access to mobile phones. Penetration rate is now at 73%, with 40% of that being smartphones. Just to give a perspective on that, the iPhone was introduced in 2007, and that really kicked off the smartphone boom. In 7 years, to see that heavy of a change, it's just staggering. So we know that the writing is clearly on the wall that internet access will continue to rise, especially through smartphones. In fact, most of the developing world's primary access to the internet is and will continue to be on mobile devices. What that means is it means that our content needs to work on smaller screens and in different languages. Before we move on, let's look at the top 10 languages really quick and pay special attention to the coded character sets you'll need to support for your site, aka the what the heck is that kind of writing. Number 1 with a bullet is Mandarin, with 1.2 billion speakers. Again, this is spoken language, so we're not going to get into how you're actually going to have to display it, which will be similar to how you're seeing it on screen, traditional versus simplified Chinese. We're just going spoken languages. Second, with about a third of the speakers of Mandarin, is Spanish with 414 million. Third is good old English with 335. Fourth is Hindi with 260 million speakers. And again, pay special attention to the way that these languages are formatted. Fifth, Arabic with 237. Portuguese in sixth with 215. Bengali with 205. Russian, 155. Japanese, 125. And rounding out the top 10, Punjabi, both India and Pakistan are represented here, with 102 million speakers. This diverse group of the top 10 languages, not even accounting for the localized variances, still only accounts for under a half of the world's population. The amazing thing is that many of these languages are in character sets that our sites don't currently support, and they read differently than our solutions can currently accommodate. So now that we're better prepared for translations and localizations, let's figure out our own locale, or where we are. Let's take a look at the address field. Here's an address. Not bad, pretty straightforward. There's a street number, street name, city, state, zip, country. Everything's covered, right? Well, if you think we're stopping there, then you've either been sleeping through this or you're just not that bright. I'm sorry. What about fields like province, postal code, building, sub-building, premise number, premise range, thoroughfare, sub-locality, double dependent locality? I'm not making these things up. Addresses are messy and widely vary from country to country. Here's a UK example. There's letters in the street number, and they call it a postal code instead of a zip code. There's a space for some reason in the middle of that postal code. London is just randomly all capitalized. How about Hong Kong? That's right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Soak it all in. Hurts so good. My thoughts exactly, Mr. Koala. Since every country just has to be a unique snowflake, at least the ISO will lay down the law for us. What the heck? Nothing? You see, there have been multiple attempts to standardize, but they've all either been pulled or they've had to settle for just nicer ways of presenting existing formats. There is no universal solution. There is an organization called the Universal Post Union. Hey, look at an acronym that actually makes sense. It's called the UPU. It's run by the UN, but even their effort boils down to templates for processing all the different address formats. They're not trying to standardize at a global level. So what are we going to do now? There are so many rules in place, and it's changing very often, and we don't have the time or resources to dedicate to keeping our libraries up to date with all this madness. So there's only one thing we can do. Let's make someone else accountable. There are plenty of services that will take your users' inputs, digest them for you, and give them back to you in a way that you can store and process. A lot of these have confidence ratings for your address accuracy that allows you to either auto-accept and format the inputted data, or you can prompt the user to confirm what you assume that address is supposed to be. There are some setbacks to this system, such as the service's database being current for newer construction, but the ease and accuracy far outweigh any of the caveats. So for this, the best thing we can do is just give users kind of a blank template for their address. You see, the funny thing is, the user is actually going to be a lot more intimately familiar with the intricacies of some of the address inputs that they're trying to put in. So if we can let them almost steer us closer to the right decision, all the better. So addresses, we'll just count them as somebody else's problem. Now let's take a moment to look back at what we've been able to accomplish today. We've solved dates, times, time zones, currency, phone numbers. We made our site mobile friendly and internationalization ready. And we kind of addressed addresses. We've been busy, little beavers. And you know what that means? Make It Rain Pizza is now ready to go global. Now nothing can stop our expansion as we allow users to make it rain glorious pizza from the heavens. Visit me at my website at rabbitpuffin.com as I continue to expand on and investigate universal interfaces. And follow me on Twitter at rabbitpuffin for more updates.